I wanted to welcome you all to our third and final webinar on our series on using climate change information in water utilities. My name is Guillaume Mauger. I'm a research scientist at the Climate Impacts Group. I'm co-leading this project with Heidi Rupp, who was formerly of our group and is now at University of Minnesota, unfortunately for us, fortunately for the University of Minnesota. And Julie Tolmie, who's really done a lot of the hard work and heavy lifting on this project. So you'll see all three of us in addition to the speakers and the other panelists, who I'll mention in a moment. Okay, so then I wanted to tell you all, many of you probably responded to our survey earlier in the summer. I believe that went out in June, and I wanted to just summarize what we heard from that. We did follow up that survey with a couple of focus group calls. We had about 120 respondents to our survey, we were really pleased and surprised that we got such a good response. And we followed that up with some more in-depth conversations with about 30 folks. Who we heard from was a mixture across the Pacific Northwest. We were shooting for Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and if possible, Alaska. And we heard from mostly Washington, but we did hear a good number of responses from Oregon and Idaho, and a bit from even California and Utah. In terms of impacts that folks listed that they were concerned about, drought was the leading concern, but followed not far behind by concerns about declining snowpack, likely related to drought, as well as extreme precipitation, primarily for stormwater reasons, and flooding. We also asked if folks used climate change information. 43% said they did, and 25% said they partially use that information, which I believe means probably in the initial stages of exploring what's out there. And so these webinars were motivated directly by what we heard in those surveys and focus groups. And what we heard a number of really interesting things, but one of the big things we heard was that folks wanted to hear from their peers about what they're doing about climate change. And that's how we've tried to organize these webinars. So that's the summary of what we've heard. I'll tell you about today's webinar and how it fits with what we heard. We wanted to start by just getting with this quick poll just to see who's on the call with us. And so Julie, if you could put that up. And if everyone who's on the call could respond, that we'll be able to show you the results in a moment. I'll wait while folks respond, and then in a minute or two we can look at the results. Thanks. Well, I think let's stop there, because I think it's probably better for us to move on. I apologize for those who didn't see the poll. Looks like we've got a lot of folks from Washington State, but we do have some representation from Oregon and California. Stormwater management is by far the dominant category of folks, which makes sense given the theme of today's talk. We have a range of utility sizes, including small and large. And a majority of folks using climate change information, primarily from university websites, but also federal professional organizations and their own organizations. Okay, great. Thanks for doing that. We appreciate it. And now let's move on. So now I get to introduce today's speaker. So today we're lucky enough to have Nishant Parulekar speaking about their work. Title of his talk, Throw Away Your Crystal Ball, a stress testing approach to infrastructure planning under climate change uncertainty. So just a little bit about Nishant. He's a professional civil engineer with the Bureau of Environmental Services in Portland. And he's the manager of the resilience team. He has over 12 years of experience. He was the project manager for the Bureau's Resiliency Master Plan. And he currently focuses on asset management to support planning and capital implementation efforts on both seismic and climate resiliency projects.
First off, I wanted to start by clearing my conscience. After providing the title here, I thought it was irresponsible to throw away your crystal ball. So I wanted to recycle your crystal ball, given our current environment. Then I realized some of you are probably high-end crystal ballers. You might have those quartz crystal balls, which has a high carbon footprint. So I am resetting my karma by saying repurpose your crystal ball. You can use it for back massage or something. So with that said, my name is Nishant Parulakar, civil engineer with the Bureau of Environmental Services in Portland, Oregon. Our bureau is responsible for the wastewater and stormwater infrastructure for the city, as well as managing the health of our watersheds and ecosystems. We have a wide variety of green and gray assets that we own and manage. This presentation centers around our combined sanitary systems. And I just want to give you an idea of our service area. So we have roughly 650,000 customers. This is our City of Portland boundary, and you can see the Columbia and Willamette Rivers. That red star is roughly where our downtown area is. And then those inner neighborhoods surrounding the Willamette River in yellow, peach, and kind of greenish colors. That's where our combined system is predominantly located. So that's where we're most concerned about CSOs. And those outer areas were developed later on, and those tend to be our separated systems. All right, so I think I mentioned, let's see. So you have an idea of our service system, and we're primarily interested here in our combined system for what I'm presenting to you all here. And you'll see shortly why. I wanted to note that BES operates independently from other infrastructure bureaus in the city. So if you have questions about water supply planning, that's from the Water Bureau, and they operate like their own utility. However, there is a citywide resiliency climate strategy group. We get together every 2 months. There are representatives from the major infrastructure bureaus and our major planning bureaus. We get together, talk about the latest climate science, what each bureau is working on, and then kind of how our group efforts work towards our citywide climate goals. So there is coordination that goes on both within and outside of that group amongst the bureaus. But again, we only have control over what we do in the water, wastewater, and watershed systems. And then I just wanted to note that just for background, as mentioned in my intro, I worked on the Resiliency Master Plan for our bureau, which focus on seismic and climate resiliency. So what I'm presenting here is based on the pilot study work that we summarized in our resiliency plan. So we started our project by taking a broad look at various climate change risks to our built and natural systems. So like many of you, we have regulatory obligations to convey certain design storms based on the season. We have flooding risk in downtown economic corridors, as well as historically disadvantaged communities out east. And then we have other concerns like landslides that might impact regional transit corridors and isolate communities. So a lot of different risks. And in the big picture, you know, what we are expecting is hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. So the challenge was to take that generalized problem statement and then drill down to the detailed analysis that would let us take specific actions and prepare. And so we focused on local flooding. For a number of reasons, we invest millions of dollars every year in capital infrastructure for our conveyance system. Also, it's where a lot of the risk in our system lives, is in our conveyance system. And this project was also housed in our asset management group, which also included our modeling team. And our modeling team supports both planning and design. So it just made sense for us to focus on local flooding. And so our initial thinking when that project started was that the resilience plan, we wanted to see how future climate storms would impact our levels of service related to sewer overflows and especially basement backups. So the idea was that we would select a few representative future climate models, downscale those models, apply them to our data, and then get projected design storms, which we could then run in our modeling process to understand what that future climate risk might look like. And then we could develop our adaptation measures according to that. So we had kind of a simplified assumption of how things might work out. But going through that process, we encountered some challenges. for one, we just learned a lot more about the uncertainty that comes from downscaling those models. It's kind of assumptions stacked on assumptions, which brings in a lot of uncertainty. Some professionals call it deep uncertainty. So there's a challenge in making decisions under that deep uncertainty framework. And then we also found the downscale models provide daily precipitation volumes, but we didn't find a method to confidently pull out sub-daily intensities from those daily precipitation volumes, because when in our design storms that we model, we use 5-minute, 15-minute, 30-minute increments or time steps for our models, and so it's really hard to pull out those types of time steps from the daily downscale data. We did make an effort to try to correlate our existing data, our peak daily intensities to peak daily volumes, but we didn't, and we thought we could then shoehorn the downscale data into our design storms if we found the correlation there, but we did not find that correlation. And then, even if we did, I think we'd have to acknowledge that that relationship of volume and intensity change in the future, that may change, in the future. So we weren't sure if that correlation would hold up. So even if we were successful. So there was a lot of frustration, crying, some difficulties there. And so moving forward when that plan kind of didn't work out, we explored two specific options. One was a qualitative based option called scenario planning, which I'm not going to really speak to here. And the other one is a more quantitative based approach called stress testing or sensitivity analysis. And I think the concept is pretty simple. Stress testing, essentially, it allows you to vary volume and intensity of your design storms to see how those impacts may unfold in your system. And the benefit there is you don't have to know what the future necessarily looks like. You're essentially just kind of playing with your design storms to see what happens to your risk. So in applying this, we chose a basin where we have done a lot of recent good work, which meant we also had a lot of recent good data about the system. We knew there were capacity problems causing basement backups. There's both gray and green infrastructure here. We knew a lot about the community, and it's a basin where we thought, this is the type of work we want to do throughout our system. So it's kind of a best practices basin. And I think that's the type of basin you want to stress test, right? If that's your best foot going forward, that's what you want to stress test. So we chose this basin, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of background in the role of design storms in our final capital solutions and how we make projects happen. So, typically for capacity projects, we start with a set of design storms, and then we run hydrologic and hydraulic models, which many of you do. Then we look at the hydraulic grade lines, and then we compare those grade lines to basement data. And so we have a lot of parcel data and basement data, and so we have a way to understand which basements have a risk of backup from our models. And then we have a cost associated with those basement backups. So it's a monetized risk, and we look at it over a certain time frame. And then, so risk, if you're not familiar, again, we speak in an asset management framework, it's the likelihood of failure times the consequence of failure. So that basement backup is one of the consequences, and then that design storm frequency informs the likelihood of failure. And so then we get our risk, and that risk informs with that risk, that monetized risk, we do a benefit cost analysis with our alternatives and find out which is the best solution for us to implement. So again, we start with the storm, that informs our risk. We do our benefit cost analysis and compare alternatives and move forward. That's kind of the high level. This is just a snapshot of what our model network looked like for this space. And here, I just wanted to give you an idea of what modifying that design storm looks like. So in the top right here, that's our 25-year, 6-hour design storm. You can see from that storm's profile, the intensity is, it's front loaded. So it starts off at the high intensity and then it tapers off. quickly and lasts 6 hours. The graph on the bottom right is the logarithmic representation of this. And so to modify this design storm, we just have a fancy pants spreadsheet, really. And we fit a curve to the design storm. And then we use this Excel spreadsheet to vary the intensity and volume of that storm by a certain percentage to modify it. And so we're working with increments of 10% where we'd so for example, if we vary the intensity, just the intensity, hold the volume the same, the storm profile may look like this, with this orangish red line looks like compared to the base storm. And then if we're changing just the volume, the profile changes like this. So that's basically how we varied from 0 to 50%, both volume and intensity, and then combinations thereof in between. So in applying that, this graph here in the bottom left, it shows our baseline. So this is if we just run our design storm in our existing system, no sensitivity analysis applied. Those blue parcels show, those are the parcels that are susceptible to basement backup. So that's our baseline risk, right? Going forward. Then we slowly increase just the volume in an increment of 10% up to 50%. So there's no intensity change, just volume change. And those red parcels there show that additional risk that shows up from this stress test. And then we did the same thing for just intensity, increasing intensity, but not volume, up to 50%. And you can see automatically that this basin, which is similar to many of our basins, it's much more sensitive to intensity changes. So you'll see a lot more risk there show up in intensity. And then we did the combinations thereof, and the top right is the worst case scenario where we've increased both intensity and volume by 50%. So what can this tell us? So this is the lower risk scenario with just volume increases. And the circles here highlight where we may end up seeing a new risk first show up if the storms start changing due to climate change. These 3 circle areas might constitute maybe one project, but it's just interesting as this first risk shows up. These are the areas we may want to monitor in the system for reports. In this this is the worst case scenario where we've increased both intensity and volume. What might be interesting here is to see where areas that are kind of resilient, where we may not see that flooding or basement backup. This may inform planning purposes, or you can do a lot with this, but it's just interesting to see areas that tend to be safer or may see impacts later on in the climate change process. And then, so you can map this as you vary the intensity and volume in our system. So this graph on the left, our bottom left corner is the baseline, 0% change, so 0% failure increase. So failure increase is just an additional basement backups. And then you can see as we increase just the volume, we have a 48% increase in failures, versus if you look at just the intensity increase, it goes up to 160%. So much bigger difference in intensity, and then you can see the combination of 187%. And I mentioned previously how we use benefit cost analysis. So you can take the design storms and chart them. And so City of Portland, we have one assumption at BES on how much those basement backups are worth in terms of dollars risk. But the U.S. Army Corps also has their own, I think, a flood depth damage assessment where you can look at the hydraulic grade lines and the parcels and come up with the dollar cost there. And so you can chart, by increasing volume, how much expected annual damage you may have based on how those storms vary. And this doesn't give you any answers. This just gives you a little bit more awareness of what might happen. And what I see is this might inform policy or kind of your risk tolerance. If you're using the asset management framework, you want to manage an acceptable level of risk in a cost-effective manner. You can't eliminate all risk. You don't want to. It'll probably be too cost prohibitive, but you may use information like this to choose a threshold for which you want to invest, but accept no additional risk. So. And then we also use the results to do some very rough modeling. So you can see how this may help with capital planning. And so this gray line going through the basins, those are portions of the trunk line that we upsize. And the yellow and blue parcels show in the low risk scenario which parcels were susceptible to basement backup. And so the blue parcels show by upsizing where you have relieved that risk. So you've addressed that risk by upsizing that pipe. I'll draw your attention to the top right where that green circle is. We may not invest in upsize trunk there because look at how much pipe you have to upsize, but you get very little risk relief, just a few of those blue parcels there for that capital investment. So that investment may really focus on that big blue cluster there. That's where it may be more worth the investment. So this kind of gives you an idea, possibly, again, just makes you more aware of what risk you may or may not be able to address, depending what the future looks like. And so now I wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge that our Bureau, it has been very fortunate to have many years of data research to understand our collection system and the connected buildings and to develop a basement backup risk. We also have a really good team of modelers who have figured out ways to automate certain processes. And we also have access to a local university who sends us interns to do some of more mundane tasks involved here. So we benefited a lot from history and resources, but you don't have to have this knowledge of your basement backup risks to still get value, I think, from the stress testing process. So, even if you didn't have basement flooding backup risk, you can just do, if you have a straightforward model, you can just still do the same stress testing and you can just chart out how many hundreds of feet or thousands of feet of additional surcharge pipe and manholes do I have in the system as we vary the design storm. You can look at where that street flooding may happen. Are those in high consequence areas? So is that in front of community centers or hospitals or in your most important economic corridors? You can also use that information, in that high-risk scenario. We said, hey, these are areas that are last to be impacted. Maybe that informs where you want resilient facility location design. Again, it can also just inform you where you might first start see changes in overflow reports and where you might last see overflow reports in your system. So there's still benefits, even if you don't have all that detailed information about basement backups like we did. There's still ways to apply stress testing, based on how you look at risk in your system to still get some value and some more awareness of what might happen in the future. And then aside from stress testing, we discovered we just explored one other item that was kind of an aha moment. So this is like when you're in an infomercial and you call on that, and within 5 minutes you get that bonus spatula. That's this part of the presentation. So enjoy this. So even without sensitivity analysis, we took a pause to just look at our basic design storm, because I started at the Bureau right when this project began, so I didn't have much familiarity with it. We asked some questions, and it turns out that design storm had some mysterious origins about how it came to be. But we did find that it was mostly based on one gauge in our system that collected data from 1945 to 1990 with good detail. So most of the design storm is based on that single gauge in that time frame. But what we did was we took more recent data. Our RAIN network had expanded a lot in the last few decades. And so our modelers aggregated some of the more recent data and compared it to our design storm data. And when comparing more average recent data sets to single sites, we found some variations. So this chart in the blue with those shorter durations, the blue shows that the more recently measured data has greater rainfall depths than our single site locations, and that those red values indicate where the gauges have less rainfall depths than our single site location. So these variations don't necessarily mean that they happen because of climate change. It could be data quality, but it's just good to be aware that there are these types of variations in our system. And then similarly, if you have just a spread out system, or you might be susceptible to microclimates that we are here, we did a similar analysis on gauges on the eastern side versus western and central city. And we also saw variations there when you compare them to just our basic design storm assumptions. So this may inform, again, where you're modeling. You may choose a different design storm or different sets of design storms based on where that basin is located in your system. So there you go, your climate spatula for attending this presentation. Just wanted to conclude with some stress testing process, our big takeaways. We found that, again, this basin is more sensitive to intensity than volume, but this could be different for other basins. So we want to run this through our remainder basins, just to, again, be aware of what's possible out there. We have a little bit better sense of where those initial new areas to be affected might be, as well as which areas might be affected much later on. There is an opportunity to test capital alternatives in this process. You could develop a crude benefit cost analysis, a business case based on those future scenarios. And then again, just those assumptions about the design storms can make a difference. I want to note that I put this blue star together here next to shape. And if you look at that graph on the right, that blue star is located roughly around like the 35% intersections of intensity increase and volume increase. And what we did was we actually took our front-loaded design storm. You saw that profile where the intensity was up front. And we just shifted where the peak intensity was to make it a center peak storm. So it starts off low, the intensity peaks around the 3-hour mark, and then it drops off. And so without changing intensity or volume, we found that the results were the same as if you took your basic design storm and just increased the intensity and volume by 35% roughly. So again, those assumptions about just what you're working with now kind of matter. So that's all very, very interesting. So really what we're looking at is maybe a broader suite of storms to check our system for the future. And we're also exploring continuous simulation and whether or not maybe historic storms should be the new norm. Typically when we run our models, we have different suites of storms that we run based on what we need to do. And then I'm sorry, I did have some final thoughts, I guess, on climate change for utilities. This was just based on some of the comments I'd heard from the previous week on the webinar, and just thought I'd throw my hat in there. So, we are fortunate that the city of Portland believes in climate change. So it's not that you have to argue hard for leadership and planners and designers to take it seriously. But I still think that, with the uncertainty out there, it's still hard. It requires a cultural shift amongst planners and engineers to how to design around that uncertainty. We are still in a position where we are not confident yet enough to point to a certain design standard for the future, especially if you're an engineer and you're designing assets that are going to be in the ground in theory 100 years. What that asset's going to be subject to in 100 years, it's hard to say based on our current information, at least for what we've established or not established as policy or design standards within our bureau. So I do think there's still a challenge, even if you believe in the climate science, there's still a cultural shift and some challenges there in decision making. And then there was a question about, well, or alluded to, what do you do if you don't have leaders that believe in climate science? And I think really the best argument or lever might be the financial responsibility or obligations to acknowledge it. So WUCA has this really great report. Sorry, that's the Water Utility Climate Alliance. If you go to their website, they have this free report on insurance bond ratings and climate risk. And for bond rating agencies, climate risk is assessed as part of the review of the utility's operational risk management and financial management assessment. So, and we all issue bonds to finance our capital projects. And so bond rating agencies are increasingly being interested in what utilities know about their system in terms of climate vulnerability and what plans we have. I was kind of caught off guard at the heels of this or at the end of this project. Our business services group pulled me in to provide some language to a bonding policy, I think that's what it's called, that was being issued on our climate vulnerability and what our mitigation and adaptation steps were. So I think that's becoming an increasing area of concern for bond agencies and as well bond rating agencies, and then also insurance agencies are becoming more concerned about insuring facilities that might be in climate hazard areas. So I think, you know, those financial stewardship issues might be the best lever if you have leaders that may not totally buy off on climate change. And I just want to note also on the flip side, insurance policy might also be a tool in your climate adaptation toolkit where you just settle on insurance policies to address failures in your system. And then just finally, you know, climate adaptation, it can be a really big lift and it's a big challenge, but I do want to end on a little bit more positive note that it's also a great opportunity to make some maybe big changes that you need in your system. Hopefully it's a way that, you know, if we're moving forward, we won't be necessarily preserving an older way of thinking or doing things. Maybe an opportunity to really engage with your community and customers, show them the value of your utility and what you're bringing to them. Certainly social justice and equity issues, there's a huge intersection between climate vulnerable communities and social justice. And so, you know, if you are working on climate adaptation projects, you know, take advantage and pile on as much as you can. There are multiple wins in just addressing that challenge. And I think with that, I'm done. Thank you. Oh, and I did want to thank we had some really great folks work on this project. Nick McCullough from my bureau, he actually did most of the heavy lifting for this modeling work. And then Brown and Caldwell also supported this work.
Okay, thanks, Nishant. I want to give you a virtual round of applause for the talk. Thank you. Appreciate it. And now we have time for questions. So I mentioned earlier that you can raise your hand and we can call on you and unmute you for a question, but we also do have some questions in the Q&A. So I'll start with those. And let me pull that up. So, hold on. There we go. There's the Q&A. So the first question is from Patty Nelson. She is asking, your model sensitivity goes up to 50% for intensity and volume, and she's asking why 50%, and is that what you are designing your system to?
So we are not designing it to 50%. Some of that had to do with, in the downscale data, some of the background research, there are these multiple representative concentration pathways, and maybe Guillaume, maybe you can speak to that. But one of those pathways showed that, you know, when I was talking about the range of uncertainty, it showed that those precipitation events may vary from 9 to 60%. So given that huge variation, we just thought, well, let's just see what happens when our storms vary by 50%. So it wasn't necessarily arbitrary, but we thought that was a reasonable range just for exploration purposes. And I can, if you still have more questions than that, I can follow up with you.
Okay, so it's, so the climate change projections suggested that is a ceiling. Bob Swarner is asking, what is the cost of a basement backup?
Depends where you are. So we made an assumption based on, I think, insurance claims. We use a blanket $5,000 approach, and you can do that a couple different ways. Some people do it based on property values, but we have a concern that would bias our high-end, more expensive homes against doing work in poorer neighborhoods. So we we just use a blanket assumption. But again, the U.S. Army Corps also has depth damage curve process that you can use to, I think you tie that onto property tax data as another way to calculate that risk.
Great, thanks. We have another question from Patty Nelson. She's asking about when you were showing the risk relief in the trunk line. She was wondering if that was based on volume or intensity change.
I think that scenario showed, that was our low risk scenario. So I believe that was just the additional risk you have just from volume increase. But you could apply that to the worst case scenario as well. It's whatever scenario you feel you want to see how much that upsizing addresses.
We have one more question from Bob Swarner. He's asking why the city was using a synthetic storm rather than historical storm data for the 25-year event.
So I am not a modeler. Just to say that up front, I think that is just one of our standard design storms that we run through the system. We have a suite of, I think, 5 or 6 sets of storms. And I know we are looking more towards, as I mentioned, using historical storms as a metric, saying this historical storm is now the future that we are designing for. And then also looking at multi-decade continuous simulation as well. I'm not sure, maybe that was just easier to work with in terms of curve fitting.
Thanks. All right, so we have a question from Rizwan Hamid. She is asking, or he is asking, what metrics were you looking at when you determined that there is deep uncertainty in redeveloping design storms from downscale climate change data? So the question is about also about getting to that 10 to 50% change in intensity and volume.
So let's see, what metrics are looking at when you determine that there's deep uncertainty? So the deep uncertainty, it's kind of that came about through literature research in downscale, what occurs in the downscaling process. I'm actually not the best position to talk about it, but Guillaume, I don't know if you want to address that or if that's come across your table as well.
I mean, so deep uncertainty is something we talk about a lot in climate change because of a lot of the things you already mentioned, right? There's uncertainties stacking on top of uncertainties. You know, and it's one of the reasons, and then there's also uncertainties in terms of when you're looking at impacts and adaptation, how we respond, what are the options, and what are other things that can change in the future in addition to climate change. Those percentages, having not looked at the results for Portland, they look reasonable compared to what I've seen in Washington as a range for change in intensity and volume. So it makes sense that those were the choices. And that there are some models that do show increases in intensity or volume higher than that, but they're the exception, not the norm. And so I think it makes sense as a range in that sense. So we have another question, Frank Blaha, is do the bond rating agencies or insurance agencies require any certain design, storm, or data record in order to meet their requirements?
No, we haven't seen that at all. Right now, I feel that they're just starting to understand those types of risks and are more curious on are utilities aware or have they even looked at this risk? So based on my experience and what I know, that there are no requirements for those types of storms or future considerations. The feeling I got was, hey, you're a utility. Do you even know what types of vulnerabilities you have in your system? And do you have a plan to address those vulnerabilities so that when we're issuing you, good rating for your bonds, our customers can feel confident that they'll get paid and all of that. So that's the sense I get where it is now. I don't know where it will go in the future. And I like bonds and all that stuff, insurance policies, that is not my comfort zone at all. It's just my experience.
Okay, thanks. We've got a congratulatory comment from Karen Metchis, says this is a great presentation. She also has a question, given how important design storms are to so much different infrastructure, have you shared this method with other public works departments, and are you using this to inform land use decisions, inform those at risk, et cetera?
I've shared this to a certain extent. I had this presentation at the National Adaptation Forum. We talk about sensitivity testing and a couple local presentations, and that this might be another pretty good sharing of the information. That's been pretty much the extent of it. But I'm happy if any of you want the detailed memo that went with this or a copy of the report, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share it with you.
And this is probably a good time to remind folks that we are recording the webinar and it's going to be put online so folks can view it and you can pass it along to others who you think might be interested. Okay, we have a question from Michael Tarbert. Has the Bureau identified a funding source or a funding program to address these needs?
Not currently. So what's interesting is this project concluded with these findings from the pilot study. And then we went through a massive Bureau reorganization. So I got moved to a different group, and we're also changing our modeling platform to better do like continuous simulation and other types of modeling. So we have a lot of changes going on at the same time, and I feel like this work is waiting for that put me in the game coach moment. We are transitioning to a portfolio management structure for our Bureau, and I'm advocating for climate change, like climate resiliency metrics with a dedicated climate portfolio funding, hopefully to meet certain goals at certain timeframe benchmarks. I don't have control how that goes, but that's just what I'm advocating for so that we have dedicated investment dollars. That said, you know, we do a lot of green infrastructure and a lot of climate mitigation as part of our existing projects. And you know, on the seismic side, which is a totally different project, but this perspective may still apply. The climate resiliency sometimes is an additional add-on to a project you would do anyway. So it may, you know, if you're looking at the funding needs, it's not necessarily that full project that you need funded. It's that incremental additional amount that addresses the future climate. And that may help you if you're trying to find reasonable budget to move forward. So it's just a perspective I want to have there. But yeah, I'm hoping we'll get a dedicated funding portfolio for this work.
Great, thanks. And I misinterpreted Karen's previous question. She was asking about sharing the information with other departments within Portland, and if that's been part of the, you know, the Water Bureau or other conversations with others.
Yeah, we had members from the Water Bureau, our planning department, planning sustainability on our technical advisory committee. So they were very involved in this process. They reviewed the reports. They're quite aware of our process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I should mention, Nishant isn't saying, but there was a conference last October in Portland where these same results were shared. This is where I first heard about it. So there's, I think, quite a bit of conversation around it. Especially given that it's a bottom-up analysis as opposed to the typical top-down climate change analysis. Okay, we have two more questions. One from Amin Majpour. As you mentioned, climate change can have an impact on storm patterns. How do you think the results might be if you add that component to your stress testing analysis? So I think the question is about the distribution of rainfall in an event.
I don't have any way to comment on that. I feel like I'm not informed enough about that. I think again the value there is in a little bit in stress testing and testing out a variety of patterns, continuous simulations, historic storms. I don't have a comment on that, but Guillaume, I don't know if you or your team do.
Well, I think my sense is the scale which you're doing the stress testing is pretty small for there to be much in terms of variations, but you did show, looking at other regions outside of Portland, because that was just one part of Portland, when you were looking at your design storm analysis, how the gauges did show differences. So that would be a way in which you did see it, and if you're continuing to work in other parts of the city, it would be incorporated. Yeah.
That's
okay. We have just a few more questions. Amy Waterman is asking how you're going to use the results, BES or others.
So kind of like I mentioned, we're kind of in this holding position right now in how to build this into our business process. I think what we do is we add stress testing as just another set of analysis we do for each planning and design project, in addition to continuous simulation, historical storm events, and the standard design. And you kind of build a better situational awareness of what might happen in the future. And then I'm not sure if then you add a layer of policy on top of it, saying this is how much additional risk we're willing to tolerate in our future. And beyond that, that's when we start investing in capital dollars or other approaches, inflow control. So we're waiting to see. I think it's just, again, it's another tool in the system. Doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, but gives you a little bit more information on what you may be dealing with.
Thanks. Okay, thanks, Nishant. I think that's all. There's a lot of good questions. People were obviously very interested. Another virtual round of applause for Nishant. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to move on to the remainder of our call. So we've got a half hour left, and what I want to do now is talk about a few tools and then get a chance for you all to ask your questions about those tools. And for us, the panelists at large, some of whom I haven't introduced yet, and I will, to answer any questions that come up. And so those of you who signed up for the webinar, I think everyone should have received this 2-page, very brief census of a bunch of resources that are out there right now. It's by no means complete, intended to be kind of quick, high-level intro. And what I want to do here is dive into 2 or 3 resources that are out there. If you didn't, for whatever reason, get the attachment I'm mentioning, you see the screenshots here. That link on this slide is the link to it. You can also probably find the page on our webinars by Googling it or in your email, and it's linked on that page as well. So I want to focus on just a few resources, and it's going to be a brief overview, and then in order to save as much time as possible for you to ask your questions as they come up. First I wanted to mention is the Climate Resilience Toolkit. This is kind of a clearinghouse or central website for climate change planning resources. It includes results from a whole bunch of agencies and organizations, but was put together by NOAA. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to focus on the other tools, but I did want to mention one thing, a few quick things, actually. The website includes guidance. You can see those 3 buttons. The first button is guidance, basically an approach for planning for climate change. It also includes case studies and also a bunch of resources and tools. Those are the 2 other buttons. And I want to focus on the case studies. You can get them from that button down below or in this link at the top. And there's case studies across the nation that you can look at and actually beyond. And just as one example, here's one case study for Frederickstown, Missouri. I brought it up because they were looking at water supply risks. So applicable to a lot of the folks on this call. This one happens to actually be a case study about how they use the EPA resources that I'll show you in a minute. But there are a variety of other case studies that are shown in those examples, that some of which use the EPA resources, some of which use other resources, some of which do it on their own. And then what I like about this page is that the case studies are classified in terms of where they sit in the sort of resilience planning approach that their guidelines, they provide in their guidelines on this page. Okay, so, and then but the main reason for mentioning the Climate Resilience Toolkit is to highlight the Water Resources Dashboard. That's one of the resources that is linked from that page. This was a collection of tools and resources put together by NOAA. And I just want to highlight a few of those tools that are on there to give you a taste for what's there. And there's more than what I'm showing you, but this will give you a sense of what's there. So for example, there's a really good one to start with, I think, is a story map that's actually created for illustrating how these tools could be used or resources could be used in water utility planning. And it's actually linked in the first paragraph on the landing page. So it's pretty easy to find. This is what the first page looks like. And it shows you the tools on the Water Resources Dashboard include both looking at the past as well as near-term forecasts and long-term climate change information. I'll show you some examples of each. And those are also, some of them are also highlighted in this story map. The big climate change one that I wanted to highlight that's on the Water Resources Dashboard is called the Climate Explorer. There you can enter a location and you can look at a variety of things, maps, long-term change plots. You can look at tidal information. You can look at past weather information. You can input thresholds. Like if you have a, if 2 inches of rainfall is something you're concerned about, you can look at when that might happen in the future or how often. So just an example, here's a map. It's got this nice slider bar. So what you see to the right of that slider bar is future, and what you see to the left is past, and you can slide it back and forth. Right here, I'm showing the southern half of Washington State and the northern half of Oregon. So Portland is over here. This is the Richland, Kennewick area in Washington, eastern Washington. In this case, I'm looking at temperature, but there's a bunch of other climate metrics you can look at as well. Another one I wanted to highlight is the NOAA Atlas 14. It's a precipitation frequency atlas. Engineers will be familiar with this. This is something that's commonly used when you go to design something, pipes or whatever, and you need to know, for example, say the 24-hour, 100-year precipitation event. You can look it up. These have been developed historically by NOAA. The ones that are used in Washington State date back to the 1970s. And you can see that's highlighted in this map. All the blue states have had their data updated to what's now called the Atlas 14 data set. The states in the Pacific Northwest have not been updated because actually the states have not funded that update. And I wanted to highlight this, even though what I'm showing you here is a resource that you cannot use, because this is actually, at least in Washington State, I don't know about Oregon and Idaho. It's a bit of an equity issue. Western Washington has been able to afford to pay for consulting firms to develop their own replacement for the 1970s data that everyone else is stuck with as a result, because there hasn't been an update to it. Another example is drought resources. A lot of folks in our surveys mentioned water supply as a concern. This takes you straight to the landing page for the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, which is a branch of NOAA focusing on drought. And there's a whole bunch of information here, everything from seminars and different ways, different forms of peer learning, as well as resources and tools, maps, guidelines, and even new research on the topic. And that includes current as well as some work on future drought. Last thing I want to mention about the resources dashboard is there have been seminars showing how to use the tools and giving an introduction to them. There's been about a dozen of them in the past, and I'm sure there will be more in the future. I also wanted to highlight that we are lucky enough to have 2 experts on the call. They were gracious enough to join us. So we have Nancy Beller-Sims on this call as a panelist. You'll be able to ask her your questions, as well as Tammy Houston, both from NOAA and both intimately familiar with these tools. So thank you, Nancy and Tammy, for being here for the Q&A. Hopefully they'll be able to answer your questions. Okay, so I want to move on to the EPA tools. And so there are 2 resources I wanted to mention for EPA. The first is this Climate Resilient Water Utilities page. And that is, I think probably pronounced CREW, and Steve, who's on the call as well, will be able to correct me if I'm wrong about that. But it's an EPA initiative designed to provide resources to water utilities for planning for extreme events. So it's for planning for extreme events currently and in the future. And one of the things I wanted to highlight on that is this Resilient Strategies Guide. This just basically takes you through a series of questions where you can make selections about your utility, your concerns, and identify strategies you could take. It's it's the main thing. So there's quite a number of things you can get out of this. It does go into funding sources. It does identify or allow you to identify a number of strategies. The main reason I wanted to highlight it is the outputs from this fairly quick to fill out form can be used as an input to the create tool. So this is really the main thing I wanted to highlight here. It's a process and tool developed by EPA, stands for Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool. Like I said, it can take as input the outputs from this, as well as other tools. And it's a module-based process that basically takes you through looking at your climate change risks and planning for them and identifying strategies and even comparing them in terms of cost benefit. So it goes right down to brass taxes. It does, because of that, require you to input a fair amount of information about your utility. But it can take you right from the sort of climate 101 phase all the way to that sort of monetary assessment of options. There are some case studies on this, and you can find those on the CREW page. So there's a chance to learn and see how others have done it. I think, like I mentioned, some of these are already featured on the Climate Resilience Toolkit page. I don't know for sure if they all are. And as with the NOAA tools, we're lucky enough to have folks here to answer your questions as they come up. So we have Steve Fries as a panelist on the call. Thanks, Steve, for joining us. I should also mention there's quite a few opportunities to partner with EPA. I believe there's trainings and there's other ways to engage as well. So that's where I want to stop. I didn't want to take up too much time. We have 15 or so minutes for questions. And I didn't do more than mention that Nancy, Tammy, and Steve are available to answer questions. I don't know if each of you, if there's anything any of you want to add, please feel free to pipe in, and then we'll go to Q&A. Okay. So we have a question, and I don't know who this should be addressed to. This is from, my apologies, I need to pause. We wanted to actually start with a poll and then go to Q&A. And Julie, would you mind putting up that poll? We want to ask a few questions, get your impressions on that tool. The tools that I just presented, and they're primarily these three that I'm showing here. Once we've done that, then I'd like to go to Q&A. Are you able to do that, Julie? Oh, there it is. It's going. Thanks. So thanks everybody for taking the time. There's only a few questions. It shouldn't take you long at all. We just want to make sure to get down your feedback. A big point of these webinars is to hear from you about what would be useful, how these tools could be augmented or improved or complemented with other resources. Whatever input you can provide is helpful to us. Okay, I'm going to wait another minute. We've got 13 people responded. Thanks to those of you who responded. And I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to leave that poll open. Anybody who has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Let me just
Guillaume, we still have folks having issues with the poll showing up. So
that's frustrating.
yeah,
okay, I'm
just
sorry.
so you know. I think if we leave it open, but just so you know, there's still
let's
some
leave it
technical
open.
difficulties.
I'm sorry, we don't really know what's going on with that. I apologize for the problem. The only thing I can think is that it may be showing up behind your Zoom window, so you may want to check. I have had that problem with other Zoom windows in the past. Okay, we do have, I'm going to go ahead and move forward and leave the poll open. We have one question from Frank Blaha. There's possibly a La Nina event forming in the Pacific. Are there any generally useful models that would allow some possible La Nina impacts in different areas that could be used for a what-if analysis? But I'm assuming Frank is sort of thinking like in the same terms as what Nishant did, but for La Nina. Maybe Tammy or Nancy, that's probably up your alley.
Yeah, I'll take that one. This is Tammy Houston at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And the data that in particular that comes to mind is data from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center that has a lot of INSO information that can be used into models. And so again, that's NOAA's Climate Prediction Center.
Oh.
This is Nancy, and I'm just going to augment what Tammy said. Is if you go on the dashboard, there's a link to the U.S. risks of seasonal climate extremes related to INSO on there, and you can go directly to the site. Well, one more thing I'm just going to add to that. In that particular case, if you go to the dashboard, there's jump off points below the picture. And in that case, we actually have a short video that describes that in a little bit more detail.
Great, thanks, Nancy. Okay, so we can go ahead and, Julie, I think you can go ahead and close the poll. We've gotten a good number of responses, so folks can see. And I apologize, Bob did bring up we should have had a none of the above option for question number 1, and we forgot that, so my apologies. But it looks like folks did hear about a lot of these tools, especially the Climate Resilience Toolkit. The clearinghouse model seems to be really useful to folks. And then we're again hearing from folks that case studies and that compelling graphics, so things that really help with communication. I'm thinking this is what we've heard before. Looks like folks are somewhat likely or very likely mostly to use the data in the Climate Resilience Toolkit, and that primarily it'd be used for planning and decision making, although engagement, communication could also be, as well as design, could be used. And for the water resources dashboard, we're seeing similar answers as well. And we did not, okay. Great. Okay, so we have plenty of time if there are any other questions that folks want to ask about any of the tools that we just presented. Julie, are there any hands raised? Folks that want to ask questions?
Nope, it looks like everybody's been using the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, well, let's wait a minute or two. Oh, here's a new Q&A question. Okay, Marissa Sekati asks, specifically calls out Tammy for this question. Is the dashboard you referred to the Water Resources Dashboard or the Climate Prediction Center? I think she may be referring to your answer about La Nina.
She was, and the answer is to both. You can go directly to CPC, or you can use the link from the dashboard to go to CPC.
Great, thanks, Tammy. Okay, I'll wait another minute or two, see if there are any more questions. Okay, we have one more question. Maureen Hodgins is asking, since today's talk was on extreme precipitation, what NOAA and EPA resources would you recommend as a first entry? So maybe Steve, since you haven't had a chance to weigh in yet, do you want to start with any EPA recommendations? And then we'll go to NOAA.
Hey, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, in terms of extreme precip, I won't speak to NOAA, of course, but for EPA, we do have some resources available for both current planning and for future planning. CREW has map resources sharing some of the same data that's in CREATE related to model projections in terms of changes in extreme precipitation. So you can look there. And we also, from our Office of Research and Development, have a tool called the Stormwater Calculator, which allows you to look at both projections as well as current conditions of precipitation from a development planning point of view. But in general, I mean, our agency is quite dependent on what NOAA provides in terms of extreme precip data, as we reframe and translate based on the constituents or the stakeholders that we're trying to serve. So I think the NOAA resources are great for primary, and then we do our best to provide applied resources for water utilities, developers, and any other regulated entities that we're trying to help.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for bringing up the Stormwater Calculator. Those of you who are interested, Heidi just put a link in the chat, and that was one of the things I didn't think I'd have time to mention in today's presentation, but it's a good one. Tammy, Nancy, do you want to add anything for NOAA's resources?
I'm going to let Tammy go. She's in the home of the data.
And well, this is where I would point to the Water Resources Dashboard, and that's because NOAA has a wide variety of different resources depending upon if you're looking for the historical, the forecast, or some of the projection information. So that's one of the reasons why we put together the dashboard, to bring these various NOAA resources into one location. And so I would point to there first, and then Nancy and I are more than happy to help point to the proper NOAA location, depending upon what specific aspect of extreme events you're looking for.
So this is Nancy. I'm just going to tag on, just because Tammy's more knowledgeable on this, but one of the cool tools that I've found that's really cool is the Climate Explorer, which is on the dashboard, where you can put in, you know, what your threshold is, and it will provide information as you can put in if it's going to rain 1 inch over 2 days, and it will provide a lot of information. Oh, good. It was about exceedance. And it's really kind of fun to play with, because you can just see what that impact would be on your particular location.
Great, thanks. All right, we have a question from Karen Metchis. Are there other tools? She's suggesting we asked the listeners, anybody who's on the call, are there other tools NOAA should add on the resources dashboard? If you have any suggestions, we'd be interested to hear it. Thanks, Heidi, for linking the chat. Any feedback? I just want to mention here, and out certainly we'd love to hear what and thought you have on that. And also wanted to mention continuing ed credits, information of attendance webinar. Okay, I think I may have gotten booted. Sorry about that. I was just wrapping up. Thank you for attending the webinar. If you didn't see it because I got cut off, I apologize, but I was mentioning that continuing ed credits, you're welcome to contact me for those, and we'll also be sending out a survey to get any thoughts you have on the content and approach for this webinar. Let's see, so thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. If I am cutting in and out, Heidi or Julie, please take over. But otherwise, I wanted to thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. Thanks again to Nishant, Nancy, Tammy, Steve for joining us. We really appreciate it. And look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thanks.